In Hopeful Abandon, a story about surrendering to the process. Written and read by Lore Amore. Intro. Dressed like a wizard, head to toe in blue velvet, and with a black gaffer tape branded travel guitar hung across my chest, I strode up the disused railway line, weaving my way through the crowds. My heart was pounding, the slamming realisation of what it was that I'd set out to do starting to sink in. I mean, who decides, after 20 years of hiding away and writing songs in their bedroom, to quit their job and tell everyone that they're going to finally release an album? And that they're going to record it live whilst busking their way around Glastonbury Festival? The same person who had rarely gotten through a single live show without forgetting their own lyrics or chords. Well, that was me, a late-diagnosed neurodivergent songwriter on a mission to finally overcome all of the challenges that had previously stopped me from sharing my music with the world. What's followed has been a process of learning, falling, failing, and picking myself back up again in pursuit of finding a way. My name's Laura, and this is the story of how I faced my fears and surrendered to the process. This is In Hopeful Abandon. Forward. Around the time that I was thinking of leaving my job, I told a friend of mine about my plan, and this was how I remember the conversation going. It may have been after a few beers. I've realised that doing things the way that I've been told to do them isn't working for me. It's never worked for me. I can't keep trying to squeeze myself into spaces that I don't fit. So I've decided that I'm going to do everything my way, and I'm going to document the whole process so that if it works out, I can then tell people how I did it, and maybe then someone else won't wait so long to finally record their first album. He grinned at me and said, "Now, not that I'm saying that it isn't going to work out, but," and we pretty much both said at the same time, "if it doesn't, I can write the book anyway." Well, this is the book. And as to whether it all worked out, that part is actually for you to decide. I'm just here to tell the story. Chapter 1. The Audition. Right, okay, maybe you could tell me the name of this one? The examiner said, tapping one of the black keys in front of her, a fixed but friendly smile on her face. I was standing in front of an electric piano in a large, unfamiliar room, aged 15. My current surroundings were just one part of a rigorous audition process for a prestigious music college that as a young, aspiring songwriter I'd set my heart on going to. And yet so far, the entire day had been a complete bomb. It really seemed like she was giving me extra chances to get it right, but it didn't matter how many times she asked. I still didn't know. G? I bit down on my lip, searching her face for cues. Sorry, I've never been very good at remembering the names of them, I grimaced. I just sort of play to feel. There was a glimmer of pity in her eyes as she wrapped up the session, and I left the room knowing now, with more certainty than any of my other answers, that the final note had not, in fact, been G. "Mum, can you drive a bit slower, please?" I pleaded a few weeks earlier as I frantically scribbled into my music theory workbook with my blunt pencil as we rolled through the Chiltern Hills to my tutor's house. Despite my parents' best efforts to support my passion for music over the years, I'd not had a great track record with formal music tuition. Beyond my scatty attention span in the orchestra when learning to play the trumpet, or the time I insisted that I only be taught System of a Down songs when learning the bass guitar, the pinnacle moment in my reflections around potentially not being the model student would have to be from the day that my first singing teacher just never came back for our follow-up lesson. The difficulty was that despite my enthusiasm towards the idea of learning, the feeling always came before the meaning of things for me, especially with music, and that made it quite hard whenever anybody would endeavour to bring the two together and have them live harmoniously in my brain. I first started to explore playing the piano at the age of 11, after my mum rescued one from a family member that had been moving house. Having always really enjoyed writing poetry and stories, it was fun to now have a way to put them to music. I'd never consciously planned to write songs. At the time I was just, playing. It hadn't occurred to me how important it might be to understand the science behind it all, or to worry about things like technique or timing. I just loved how it felt when I was alone at the keys, often composing things to then forget them. It was all-consuming, and it took me out of my own head, somewhere that I didn't always feel completely safe in, somewhere that had the tendency to drive me into the shadow parts of my psyche and leave me there without a torch or a map. I'd also always had such big feelings about my place in the world, but in all of my efforts to express myself, I was rarely able to verbalise them in a way that honoured the depths that I felt them. And yet suddenly, here it was, something that was both constructive and cathartic, an escape and a channel. I'd never known anything like it before, and so of course it became the only thing that I wanted to do. But the problem was, my journey to songwriting had been self-taught. Every chord a happy, explorative accident, and all of my songs, when I could remember them, just an accumulation of my continued experimentation. Always feeling first. Despite attending a performing arts school and my many attempts to learn more about what it was that I was playing, I'd never been able to grasp music theory. Unfortunately, however, it had been outlined as a key component of the audition process that I was in. So here I was, giving it one last shot. But much like most of my previous attempts at formal tuition, it hadn't been going so well. Once again, I'd left my homework until the day of the lesson, and as usual, I couldn't remember any of the things that had been taught to me in the previous week's session. It was like, as soon as the words left my tutor's lips, they went off and frolicked together in some kind of distant magical land that I no longer had access to. A party for all the clefs and triplets and quavers, all boogieing together to a fancy classical theme song. A place where all the real musicians got to hang out, I supposed. Oh God, he's going to give me that look again, isn't he? I thought to myself as my mum gave me a compassionate but slightly exasperated side-eye from the driver's seat. The one where he does almost everything except actually tell me that I'm completely wasting everyone's time. And next up, our very own songsmith, Evie Sky. Applause rang out in the school auditorium as I walked towards the piano on stage in front of a room full of eagerly awaiting school peers and parents at our end-of-term showcase. As I sat down, I felt the tingling running through my whole body as the sense of being perceived by the 100 or so people in the auditorium chairs hit me, making the now deathly silent room feel like a giant version of the audition space from just a few months before. I drew my hands up, praying that I would be able to settle into my usual approach when I was practicing at home and feel my way into the notes that I needed to play. But as I looked down, I felt the sinking feeling that often accompanied me any time that I had to play under pressure. It didn't matter how much I practiced alone in my bedroom or in front of the odd friend after school. As soon as I was up on stage, the overwhelm kicked in, and every time it was almost like I'd never even seen a piano before, let alone know how to play one. The mass of black and white filled my vision, swirling into one big mess in front of me, making the silence in the room feel even more crushing than just seconds before. I tested a couple of notes cautiously, and the result was a clattering, discordant ripple that seemed to capture my nerves perfectly, but resembled nothing close to the start of my song. "Sorry," I croaked into the mic, trialling out a quick nervous grin up at the audience before I looked back down at the keys again, hoping that in some way they'd start to make more sense to me now. But it was no use. I was starting to feel sick, not only because of where I was in that moment, but because of what this experience was suddenly reminding me of. Despite accepting that I might not have done so well in the theory parts of my audition, I'd always hoped that I'd have nailed the bit where I got to play my own music. That was the part I loved, after all. But just like now, I'd found myself so overwhelmed that I'd completely forgotten how to play. I felt my face burning with embarrassment. Coming back to the present moment, once again, I apologised into the mic, stood up, and walked back off stage, tears prickling in my eyes. How could I ever hope to be a professional songwriter if I couldn't even remember how to play my own songs? Just a few months later, hands trembling, I tore open the envelope that had arrived for me that morning. My parents waited anxiously in the doorway. I'd felt their eyes most mornings as I'd rushed down to inspect the post before anyone else could get to it, determined that because it had taken so long for them to get back to me, that this must be good news, right? I didn't get in, I said eventually. I took a breath in an attempt to steady myself for the influx of emotions that I knew were incoming and unstoppable. My chest tightened and I started to feel dizzy, like time and space was imploding in on me, and every sense was suddenly heightened and muffled all at once, like a wave, so familiar and yet never the same, never something that I could fully prepare myself for. First came the blinding rage at myself for not being good enough, for not practicing enough, for not trying harder to overcome my stage fright or my challenges with music theory. And then the embarrassment, as it dawned on me just how many people I'd told at school, who had all been rooting for me. And finally, the crushing disappointment of it all. Because somewhere deep down, I really believed that this was meant for me, that this was what I was supposed to do. And yet to realise that even with all of my determination and willingness, with all of the efforts from my parents and tutors, and all the encouragement from my friends and school peers, it hadn't been enough. I hadn't been good enough. And that was all there was to it. 7 years on, I stood at the bar of one of my new favourite grassroots venues in London with a pint of Guinness in my hand, chatting animatedly to a friend beside me. The place was buzzing. I could feel the butterflies in my stomach, but nothing was going to stop me from feeling good tonight. Even though I'd had my doubts about making music over the years, I'd never been able to stop writing songs. It didn't matter where I was or what was going on in my life, songwriting would always seem to find me. Often during the times when I felt least like I was able to share myself with the world, it would creep up inside of me and call out to be given time and space in my life. When I eventually started to play piano again after overcoming the rejection from the music college, I decided that I couldn't risk losing this thing that had helped so much with my processing of the world by trying to line myself up with some kind of list of standards or external expectations anymore. I was a songwriter, not a classically trained musician, and if that meant that I never played live again or ever recorded my songs for other people, then so be it. It wasn't about anyone else anymore. I was doing this for myself. I was doing it because it helped me feel through my emotions rather than sit in them all the time. I was doing it because it gave me some kind of order and purpose, and most of all because somehow it made me feel less alone when I was left by myself in my own mind. I'd been in my first year of university when my dad had lent me his acoustic guitar. Motivated by a recent breakup, I'd found myself committed to learning some basic open chords on it. Something about the ease of being able to use a capo to transpose the chords into different places had sparked up a newfound curiosity. Songs just started to flow, and all of a sudden I was finding myself more able to remember them than the ones that I wrote on piano, because of the simplicity of the hand positions that I was using. Because I wasn't writing songs for the ears of anyone else anymore, I'd also just stopped caring about having to be the best at the instruments that I was playing. Instead, using them mostly as vehicles to get down the lyrics that put words to the often complex feelings that were going on inside of me. Despite my hesitance for sharing, my family and a few close friends from school had continued to be supportive of my songwriting, and so I gradually started to play the occasional live show on guitar. Before long, I'd begun exploring the open mic scene in London and had secured my first ever 20-minute set at a pub in Camden that was known for supporting up-and-coming artists. Now old enough to drink, I'd discovered an approach to overcoming some of the nerves that had previously stopped me from being able to perform in front of people. 2 drinks was my rule, no more, no less. any less, and I knew that I'd find the mix of bright lights and different noises too stimulating to ignore, and it would send me into a state of overwhelm, unable to concentrate on what I needed to do. And any more, I'd be at risk of rambling through my set, eating into the precious limited minutes that you get as a newcomer artist, or worse, forgetting my own lyrics or chords. But tonight I was feeling confident, and a bit rebellious. It was a pretty special evening because I was about to play the first piano set that I'd done since school. I had half an hour until I was due to go on, and another friend had just offered to buy me a drink, so I was on my third. I felt great. I'd been practicing for weeks, and it was a room full of people that I knew. We'd even got the sound guys to plug in a recording device so that I could have all of the audio to share afterwards. It was going to be awesome. Suddenly I heard the familiar voice of the promoter on the PA system coming through, and I grinned, turning around to see who was on next, getting ready to give them a good old cheer. But then he locked eyes with me and started to describe the person in his usual drumming up intros, where he didn't say their name straight away but told a story of how he'd come to know them. A story that started to sound uncannily like it could only be about me. He was always so good at the intros, and the crowd had started to realise too, so I could feel the buzz building as more eyes turned my way. You can't argue with someone after they give an introduction like that. Everyone was clapping and cheering. What was I going to do? Tell them that I'd broken my golden rule and now I was one beer too many to know if I'd actually be able to remember how to play? I just had to do it. Feeling the whole room watch as I did, I walked through the crowd and took a seat at what would not only be my first live piano set in 7 years, but what would also be my last. It doesn't matter how many people tell you that you've done a good job when you've stepped off stage after a performance. If you don't feel like you've shown them what you're capable of, then there will almost always be a barrier to the compliments that you receive. By the time that I'd sat down at the piano, I'd been so overwhelmed by the last-minute changes that I ended up spending half of my set apologising for any small mistakes that I was making, which for the most part, it's unlikely anybody would have even noticed had I not pointed them out. My newfound method for overcoming stage fright suddenly much less effective or sustainable than I'd initially thought. There was also such a bitter irony to the fact that I'd spent so many years avoiding the eyes and ears of those who could have passed judgment on the way that I wrote songs, only to now find myself in the grips of such crippling, self-inflicted perfectionism. After I got home, I cried. You might feel like rolling your eyes at this point and shouting, "It was only one show, get back out there." But the thing was, at this point in my life, making music was my main source of therapy. It was a way around having to actually deal with the darkness that seemed to loom any time that I was left alone for too long in my own head, which was something that I didn't talk about a lot. When I was playing my songs, I was showing more of myself than I'd ever shown anyone, including parts that I'd not even acknowledged, let alone made peace with. How can you possibly safely share who you are with the world when you haven't even gotten to know yourself fully yet? So I saved the recording from the night onto a hard drive, and I buried the experience away, along with my audition process, in the section of my brain's filing cabinet system that said, "Maybe in the next life?" Now, from the archives, recorded live at the Fiddler's Elbow in London in 2016, Evie's song.